Alexander Beiner, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
How much psychonauting or how much psychedelic experience had you had before you underwent the DMTx trial?
So I'd had quite a lot, and actually, all of us who were on that stage of the trial were fairly experienced, and that was kind of the point. Maybe 40 or 50 ayahuasca journeys, and mushroom experiences, and LSD experiences. So DMT extended state is basically, as you mentioned, it's being injected with DMT intravenously. You're injected for 30 minutes, and the trip lasts 40 minutes because it's once they stop injecting, you're still full of DMT, and then your body is processing it. I was one of, I think there were 9 of us. I think there were 11, and then a few people dropped out, so it ended up being 9 people who were the dose finding trial. So we were like the guinea pigs for the guinea pigs, and they wanted people who had a fair amount of psychedelic experience to be able to report back on clearly on, well, what they were actually looking for was to bring us up into a peak experience and then plateau. So keep us in the peak for as long as possible, which they did really manage to do by the end. But so each dosing was progressively stronger, done differently. So it would be, there's something called a bolus. They inject more of the drug first to kind of push you over a threshold, and then they maintain a certain amount. So there was I didn't obviously see what they were doing with the pump, because as soon as it comes in, you feel this like cold sensation. And within 2 or 3 seconds, it felt like a few heartbeats instantly in the peak. Well, yeah, pretty much. It was almost like being in the peak of an ayahuasca experience within a few seconds. It's so extreme. It's such a, you go from waking consciousness to a really intense psychedelic experience within seconds. And usually with a psychedelic, unless you're smoking DMT, which is probably the closest analog. Well, I mean, it's almost exactly the same, except that the injection is stronger and comes on faster. So I was quite experienced going into it.
We talk a lot in the psychedelic realm about this idea of surrender, but I think surrender is a really abstract concept. The closest that I've ever heard someone kind of get to a grounded version of that is that surrender is sort of adjacent to curiosity. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but in terms of like training to be in those states, like what can you do?
I agree with whoever said that, because I think curiosity is one of the key capacities. Um, Not just in psychedelic experiences, but if anyone's familiar or if you've ever heard of polyvagal theory.
Mm-hmm.
So Stephen Porges is a medical doctor in the States, and he has this theory that about the vagus nerve, which kind of runs through the whole, a very important part of the nervous system. This kind of curious exploratory mode. So if you imagine we're like hunter gatherers, we're in the environment and we are wondering where the next bush full of berries is, and we're curious about what's over that next hill. And then if a tiger pops up, then we go into, I think it's the ventral vagal then, where we're like, oh, okay, fight and flight, completely different mode of thinking. We're not thinking curiously anymore. We're thinking survival and how are we going to get out of this? And he argues that curiosity, I call it curiosity hacking actually, because I teach it I use it myself, and I teach it as a practice in courses I run, where it's like whatever's going on, as long as your life isn't actually in danger, switching into curiosity, intentionally cultivating curiosity. So if you're feeling angry in an argument, becoming curious about the anger, saying, okay, interesting, I'm feeling angry right now. What is that? Like what, like not, I should feel angry. I shouldn't feel angry. Just what's going on right now? And so in that sense, absolutely, I think it's probably the most important thing. I used to run psychedelic retreats in the Netherlands. That was one of the key capacities, resources we would encourage people to cultivate in the preparation and during, of course. So there's that. There's also flexibility, which is a little bit like cognitive flexibility is something that likely increases. There's studies to suggest that it increases with psychedelic use. So that's just being psychologically flexible. It's a bit like open-mindedness, but it's more like being able to move between different positions and consider different possibilities and let something go if it's not working and move. So it's like you're dancing with your experience and you're not becoming overly attached or rigid. That's something that psychedelics can really help us cultivate. But I think if we cultivate it, it makes navigating easier. Mindfulness is another essential capacity, the ability to pay attention to your sensations and your thoughts and your feelings without reacting to them or making a story about them. Then just generally breath, just simply just being able to regulate and notice your breath and come back to the breath. So actually a lot of the skills that we learn in meditative practices are very effective in the psychedelic experience as well. Now, on the surrender thing, I also have issues with it in some way. Firstly, much of the time, yes, accepting what's going on and allowing and being curious about it is the right move. The idea of surrendering all the time is one I disagree with, because I think I'm trained as a counselor in a more trauma informed and somatic kind of modality. And so in a trauma informed approach, you have, if you imagine an infinity symbol, right? Like a figure eight on its side. On the
Mhm.
left side is where you feel resourced. So that example I gave of like, looking for the berries and we're feeling curious and what's over the next hill. That means we are feeling like resourced in the sense that we have what it takes to meet the challenges of the environment and we're okay. Then we're past in the middle of it. We go past our window of tolerance and then we are in some kind of fight or flight or trauma response. So when you're working with trauma, you don't say, for example, like this phrase that came out of the research from the 60s, go in and through. Bill Richards has an example that he gave in a talk I saw once of a participant saying in a psychedelic experience, "Oh, I'm feeling really paranoid." And he's like, "Good, good, go deeper into the paranoia." In a sense, that is actually how I often navigate my experiences, but I don't have a lot of childhood trauma. It's not right for everyone, and it's not right in every situation. There's also been times where I'm like, actually, no, what I need to do is open my eyes and take a breather and resource myself so that I
Mhm.
can go back in. And that infinity symbol, the idea is we go from our resourcing as far as we can past our window of tolerance until we notice, okay, this is too much for me, because you can think of trauma as too much, too fast, can't get away.
Mm.
So I go into it, here's my edge, and then back into when I'm feeling resourced and connected and safe. And then I go back a little bit further each time. So what I always suggest is not just blindly surrendering or going in and through, but being conscious of where is my edge, where am I at, like an in breath and an out breath, rather than you can't just have only an in breath or only an out breath. Like with
Mm.
surrender, you can't just continuously exhale. Like nothing else in life works like that. It's a synergy. It's about leaning in and doing the work with the experience or with the plant or with the fungus. In my experience, I haven't really seen that. Sometimes that really opens something up and that's what we need. But a lot of the time, if we're going into an experience to do deep inner work or metaphysical exploration, we need to be leaning in with our own agency to some degree.
You have to have that baseline safety anyway. Like, you have to have some level of safety and some idea of what it feels like in your body to actually come back to. And it's hard because, like, our lives just don't facilitate that. We're around so much technology and we're just like constantly stimulated. And so that's kind of why I asked you that question of like, how do you train for this? Because so much of it can become very intellectual and very conceptual when we're trying to understand like how to cope with really challenging experiences. But actually, like, I wonder if so much of coping with challenging experiences does actually come down to like lifestyle and
Mm.
creating enough of a baseline of safety that you can go past your window of tolerance and then bring back some data from that expands that window of tolerance. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think lifestyle for sure, and I guess what I hear you asking as well is about like practices in some sense, or like what we might be doing in our lives to facilitate that. And I think so. I think having what John Vervaeke calls, who's a cognitive scientist, uh, an ecology of practices. So no one practice gives us all the tools and skills we need, right? So just meditation. For example, people who only meditate, sometimes they haven't done a lot of work on their shadows because it's not a relational practice where you get a reflection from others to see, hey, you're being a bit of an asshole in this area. And, in a really good, say mindfulness monastic community, that could well be the case. But most of the time it's very individualized in the West. So, but meditation equally like is such an incredible practice for you know, being able to know ourselves and to be present and non-reactive. And so so kind of meditation as a practice, and then even within meditation, there's contemplation and there's mindfulness. So there's like, or rather, there's kind of concentration style meditations. So like a mantra and focus it, or like you just focusing on a candle or a flickering flame. Um, and that's a really useful practice for, what you were talking about, like the level of distraction that we have in life. A concentration practice is really great because it means, for example, you just have a candle in front of you, and this is how I learned to meditate when I was like in university. Um, and you just focus on the candle, and every time you become distracted, you just forcibly focus on the candle again. So it's just really simple practice, and it's just training focus and concentration.
Mm,
And mindfulness is different. Mindfulness requires the concentration, but mindfulness is pay attention non-judgmentally to everything that's happening and observe. So you're like laying out the welcome mat, as John Kabat-Zinn calls it, to whatever wants to unfold. That is more like zooming out and going, like the concentration is like zooming in, and then the mindfulness is like zooming out and saying, what
mm,
is happening? Now you need both of those skills. Again, like the in breath and the out breath, you need to be able to zoom in
mm,
and zoom out at different moments. And we need, people in our lives who can give us reflection, honest reflection, and who um, help us to grow as we help them to grow. So we need good relationships. Um, all the other aspects, diet, fitness, all of the things that just kind of help us be resource as human beings. So yeah, those are all key. And I then, also movement and ecstatic practices to move with the life force energy that will, come up often in the psychedelic experience. So things like ecstatic dance, or um, I really like Osho dynamic meditation, or anything that involves screaming and laughing and just being a bit mental for a bit, just kind of that real like getting things out. So there's so many different, there's such yeah, again, this phrase like an ecology of practices. That's what I think really is most useful. And then exercise, like, because that teaches, team sports, all these different things teach us everything, teach us things. And I'm not suggesting that we all, because, God knows I'm don't have the kind of time where I can like do all
Do
of
it
these
all.
things every
Yeah.
week. Like my team sports and this. I mean, I think you get a lot of that in the sort of like Silicon Valley techie world where everyone's like optimized and biohacking
Mm,
and getting up at 5 a.m. I don't even know how many of them are actually doing that though. I think
yeah.
it's nonsense. But
It's
but
its
it
own
just
kind of
means
sickness.
it's compulsive. But I think what it is useful about it is that it, like for example, I did a breathwork teacher training a few years ago, partly because I love breath work, and also because I realized that I wasn't really like a lot of the practices and things in my life I was doing. What was missing was like energy and life force and just expansion and movement. So I was like, oh, I should do some ecstatic dance, and I did one, and I just didn't go again. And I thought, okay,
Yeah.
I need something where I have a regular experience of that life force energy, and that kind of, yeah, that experience of being human. I need more of that. And then I eventually thought, well, actually, like breath work is definitely that. And then I ended up doing a teacher training. So that's, it's about finding what's missing, and then kind of filling the gap if possible.
What changed for you in your concept of intimacy after the extended DMT trial?
It's a good question. Part of the journey for me was all around connecting to myself, connecting to others. I had one particularly interesting experience, which was related to my partner at the time, like my relationship with her and my relationship with women and
Mm,
my relationship then with myself. And so there was a big theme in in the extended state trial. Now, what's really interesting, and I think many of us have this experience, especially with ayahuasca or DMT related psychedelics, sometimes the lessons come years later.
mm,
Sometimes the integration is really quite long. And it's not that you're integrating the whole time, but you might have an experience and go, huh, I don't know, I go back and forth around it. And then a few years later, come back to it and go, it was about that. Well, I guess one of the things I learned or relearned is that to really like have deep intimacy with another, you have to have that deep intimacy with yourself and to really be able to go into those uncomfortable places ourselves, so that when they come up with another, we can be present and not be shutting down, and kind of go into it. And I do think my capacity for that has increased quite a bit. But that's not just from the psychedelic, like, it's they never exist in a vacuum. It's not just from the
Mm.
DMTx. It's also because of all the other therapy and groups, workshops, and all the stuff I've done over the years. It all sort of like combines together,
Hmm.
into one process. And I think that's true of people's healing journey sometimes too. It's never just the one thing that did it.
No, no. And you
Mm.
said before that like there's all these different tools that you can have in your arsenal, but really like the most important tool that you can cultivate is discernment about which tool to use. And I think when we're talking about like what we've done in order to change our reality, it can become this like you can become really militant about people do become militant around one particular modality often because they're trying to sell a product, and that's the
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
the landscape that we live in.
There's a book called The End of Trauma by George Bonanno, who he's a trauma expert who's run sort of a trauma lab in Columbia College in America for like 20 years. What he points out in his book is that cognitive flexibility, so that ability to be flexible with your own healing process, is the number one indicator of how effectively people heal from traumatic experiences. And the thing is, to have that flexibility, often you need to have a kind of resourcing in your life and feel like you and have an environment around you that supports it. But what that actually means in practice is that someone goes, okay, I tried a yoga class and like, oof, no, it wasn't really for me. But then they tried this other thing, and then they tried IFS, and then they tried CBT therapy, and then they tried. It seems like that attitude, as much as anything else, and maybe also because with that attitude you end up coming across the thing you actually need in that moment, or you combine lots of things together, you get something out of all of those different practices. That is really quite important. Well, there's research to suggest that capacity of not just being fixed on one practice is really quite important.
Something else I've been contemplating lately is that like people don't really have or create the time and space to actually think almost like for themselves. Like we outsource so much of our thinking to technology. And something that you write about in your book is like the internet is this big thing. We need to talk about the fact that like the internet is this big thing and it's like really affecting the way we live. We log online to our social media platforms and we're in search of some kind of answer to something like, how do I lose weight? How do I grow my hair? How do I have a better relationship? And then we come across people with all of these opinions and we forget that they're actually just opinions. Like
Mm.
those people are speaking opinions, not necessarily laws or truths. But we mistake them for being truths, and then we get further and further away from what our own truth is. And so if you're doing like deep healing work and you're existing in a culture where like everyone's talking a lot about that, which at least seems to be happening on my Instagram feed, it can be really hard to like know what to do next, and whether you should stick with a practice or whether you should actually shift. Again, I think it just comes back to being like the number one skill is really discernment.
And it is really kind of like that. It has different rules. Identity is fluid, and you don't really know who to trust. So it's different to a DMT realm, but it's got similarities. Now we have AI agents floating around. So they're like the entities we encounter on DMT. We're like, are they conscious? They seem conscious, but I know they're not conscious. But do I know that? So it's just wild, crazy world. It's interesting, people who didn't grow up with the internet. So people of the boomer generation, not all of them, but very often don't have the immune system to know that an email is a scam, for example, or that
Mm.
someone is catfishing them. Whereas someone who has grown up with the internet, you can look and you know what to look for. You can be like, no, that they're someone from, Brad Pitt's not Brad Pitt at gmail.com. I don't know, or like whatever it is. It's just
Yeah, yeah.
all of that kind of thing. So, and it's just obvious, but it's not obvious if it's a realm that you're not familiar with. And the other thing I think, the other thing that came up when you were describing that is the idea that we're going through a legitimation crisis, which is a term from
Mm.
Jürgen Habermas, who's a sociologist. And it's like, it's such a fundamental thing that we don't think of very often, which is who has legitimacy. in culture? Who has the legitimacy to prescribe medicine? Who has the legitimacy to decide what's morally good or bad? And this is fundamental for any society, right? And now we're going through this whole crisis where legitimacy is up for grabs, particularly in the space of sharing information. Whereas it used to be, okay, if I picked up a newspaper in like 1950, I could be like, okay, now I might disagree with the journalist writing this piece, but they're legit because they're in this newspaper. They're in the Times, and that means that they have some kind of legitimacy. But now you can be an influencer with 1 million followers talking about anything you want, and a kind of legitimacy is conferred on you through people simply listening. That is not a real, it's an open debate. Is that real legitimacy? Should it be real legitimacy? Is that better or worse than legitimacy being decided by like one old editor?
University.
Yeah, or university, or a bunch of it's also legit to say like the power structures that were gatekeeping legitimacy were massively flawed as well. And so we're in this kind of Wild West between time where we don't know how are we going to define who's legit and who isn't.
I can imagine that after your extreme DMT experience and also other psychedelic experiences, you have some theories around what you think the mind is, like this thing that we call the mind, and how that is or isn't informing what we think of as reality. So I'm just curious to know, like, where are you at with that now? I know it's been like many years since you released that book, and you've kind of like you're exploring things outside of the psychedelic space now. But yeah, where are you at with like the nature of reality and like what the mind is and what the hell this whole thing is?
What's going on?
Yeah.
Yeah, good question. I move around with this question. It's like the biggest question. Okay, so nature of mind. This is a position I've held for a while, and then I think the DMT trial brought the question up again, and writing the book also brought the question up again because I wanted to explain to a wider audience the broad strokes philosophically of this question. And so on the one hand, you have idealists, philosophical idealists like Bernardo Kastrup and George Berkeley, who went to who was in the university I went to, Trinity College Dublin. He went there, and so and I did philosophy as well, and so he was like, we did lots of him basically because he was local, and that's the idea that fundamentally what's real is consciousness, is mind. Mind is what's real. The kind of experiencing is what's real, and matter, like the screwdriver. I don't know. I have a screwdriver. I did some flat pack. That's why there's a screwdriver on my desk. But
good for you.
Yeah, no, here we go. But this is fundamentally not of a primary reality. It's secondary in the sense that I'm having an experience of it. But what's real, what's primary, is my experience of the screwdriver and the experience of hardness, etc. It doesn't exist independently of mind. So that is not the dominant view in the West, and hasn't been for the last 400 or so years. The dominant view is that what's primary is matter, and my experience of the screwdriver is secondary. And it's because my brain is made of matter, and so this whole experience is just kind of an illusion created by the stuff, physical matter. And then there's panpsychism, which argues that actually mind and matter are the same substance. And that's kind of where I sit. I'm a panpsychist. I'm like, consciousness and matter are indistinguishable. They are kind of mutually arising. And you can't really talk about, like, for example, if my brain just shut off right now, I couldn't be having the conversation with you. So there is a relationship between the matter and the consciousness, but I also don't think my brain is generating consciousness. I think consciousness is a fundamental aspect of reality, and that the brain is more a receiver of consciousness, and that maybe any sufficiently complex system can order and structure the consciousness that is ever present in reality. So that means that that's where I sit on it. I've definitely, like, the position of the only thing that's real is matter, I think, is fundamentally the source of the crises we're facing as a species. Like that, I think that misunderstanding of the nature of experience of being a human being is fundamental, because what it does is it means that we value the quantity of things, what can be measured, over the quality of things, what can be felt
Mm,
and experienced. And nobody actually lives like that. Like nobody thinks that their child's life has a quantitative value, right?
mm,
Insurance companies do, because
mm,
that's right. But actual human beings don't do that. And when people are on their deathbeds, the most consistent thing that they say, according to some studies on this, is, I wish I had lived my life the way I wanted to live it rather than what other people wanted me to do. Or I
mm,
wish I'd spent more time with my loved ones. I wish I'd spent more time, just what they regret is not having a depth of experience of themselves and of each of other people, because they adhered to somebody else's ideas. So that also ties into it, because actually, if we orient towards quality, what it's like to be you, then it's a very different way of valuing uh, anything, right? So that's the fundamental shift that I think needs to happen, before anything else is going to change significantly.
mm. And so connect that to the DMT or the psychedelic experiences. Like, why is it that that theory feels truest for what it's like to be you?
Well, I mean, so if you go at it from the other side, that everything is just matter, then when you have a deep experience on a psychedelic, or you encounter an entity, the only thing that the hardcore materialist neuroscientist can say is, that's just your brain on drugs. That's just a kind of illusion of, that the entities are just your brain trying to make sense of chaos through creating kind of familiar kind of structures,
Mhm.
um, which they're not familiar at all. They're really alien and strange. So there's that. And so it just doesn't feel like there's not a lot you can do with that in terms of exploration or growth, because you're just like, oh, it's just like a video game. None of it's real. And I don't think that that is true. And also, what it asks you to do is say that your lived experience is less real than what is being measured. And what's ironic is that most of what comes out of psychedelic research, unless it's brain scans, and even those, recently suggested that those might all be erroneous, because that's not actually the main mechanism. I won't get into that right now, but is that they give you a questionnaire after these experiences. After the DMT, after we came out of the DMT, about 10 minutes later, we would get an iPad with like a scale that said, like, from 0 to 10, how much did your
Satisfied or
ego dissolve?
unsatisfied?
Yeah, it was like that. It's like, and you're just like, oh, and you're just like, oh, from 0 to 10, how much did you feel you were connected to the universe, literally? And you're just like, and so that is the data they're using. So they're using my experience, my qualitative experience, and then they're quantifying that to then come to truth claims. Now, there's nothing wrong with quantifying qualitative experience, but what's the error in my view is going, oh, the quantity, the numbers, and the stats that we can get out of that is more real than the quality of your experience, because they came from an experience that I had. And they
Mm.
don't know how to go, oh, well, we saw this in the EEG, scan. That must have been that he was experiencing a mantis. No, they just
A
see,
chinchilla.
yeah, or in my case, hyperdimensional chinchillas. They don't know that. They just see a change of some sort, if they even do.
I mean, that's the thing with science, though, right? Is like it's got to just throw shit at the wall and see what sticks. Like, I think it's hard to do experiments on these things,
Yeah.
and maybe we need to have different scientists or more interdisciplinary collaboration. But yeah, like that's the hard problem really of consciousness, right? Is that you can pull the brain apart and find the neuronal correlates for the color red, but like you don't actually find the color red.
Yeah.
And so the experience of the color red remains this mystical thing, moving sort of more towards the mind as being the idea of your individual self, like this continuation of the individual version of Alexander. Do you believe that there is like a conscious mind, and then there is also the subconscious, and there's this like big realm of things happening beneath it? I guess I just want to ask you if you believe
Mm.
that before I ask the follow-up question, because I
Mhm.
recently like had a conversation with someone and they were like, I don't believe in the subconscious mind. So I
Yeah.
don't know what anyone believes anymore.
Yeah, that's a a difference between psychoanalysis and say psychiatry. Sometimes that is that they're like, no, there's not. Yeah, it's fascinating. The idea that there's an
Nothing
unconscious
below the
mind,
hood.
nothing below the hood. No, I fundamentally think there is, and I think Freud and Jung were absolutely correct. Jung in particular, I'm quite Jungian, so absolutely, I think there's an unconscious, and I also think there's a collective unconscious.
Mhm.
And yeah, 100%, 100%. I think it's hard to deny, but yeah, I know some people do.
So, okay, follow-up question to that then is, do you think that it is possible to change the subconscious mind? If we agree that the subconscious mind is operating, the operating system that is below our awareness, but driving 98% of our behavior, like, is it possible to go in there and change it?
Yes, I do. But what's interesting about it is that the question that came up from your question was, how would I know? Like, my experience of changing my unconscious will involve my conscious mind. And that doesn't mean though that I'm not able to change it. Like, if you imagine, like, it's more like the unconscious is the ocean, right? And so I think it's a tricky one. I mean, part of me thinks that the ability for me to change the unconscious is limited in a sense. Let's take like cognitive behavior therapy, for example, right? Now that works very much on the conscious level of the mind of
Mhm,
changing behavior. And I found that really effective for myself in a bunch of different ways. And I've also done a lot of depth psychology and a lot of obviously psychedelic stuff. And I think
mhm,
you need both. I think you need to go into the depths and then you need to be able to change what comes up. Now, going into the depths, like in a psychedelic experience or through dream analysis or whatever it might be,
mm,
I am experiencing the unconscious and then I am kind of coming back into my conscious life with deeper insight into what's really going on under the hood. And then I'm doing something like CBT to go, okay, this thought pattern that comes from my unconscious that developed when I was a child is no longer helping me get where I want to go. So I'm going to reprogram that thought pattern. Now, that means that in my conscious waking life, I have the agency to not be dictated. The fact my unconscious is not dictating what I do. So actually, as I'm talking about it, I think the change really happens at the level of the conscious mind. And what's important, as a lot of psychologists would say or psychoanalysts, is bringing things into consciousness. Like we have to make things like, for example, in a particular system, a relationship, to name the thing that is under the hood and then bring it into the light means that it can be worked with. And then once it can be worked with, it is going to have a different effect on what's above the hood. But I
mhm.
don't know how much we can influence what's going on under it. Now, hypnosis, maybe. Um, I don't know, but like in my psychedelic experiences, no, I mean, sometimes to be fair, what I've done is I will do some deeper structural work on my unconscious in a psychedelic experience.
Mm,
And it's kind of hard to explain, but it's like deeper cognitive behavior therapy where, and
mm.
that's part of like what's happening is that we'll reframe an experience we had. And, so yes, actually, I'm going to contradict myself yet again and say, yes, I think through that kind of work, we are in a sense doing that. Although again, it's conscious again. Again.
I mean,
Yeah.
we have to, like, this is the problem with these conversations is like, or not these conversations, but this thinking. And I can't even remember whether it was like Descartes or which philosopher kind of nailed it, but it was about like, we're always thinking about thinking without thinking muscle, and it makes it really
Mm,
hard to see anything for what it really is when we're interpreting it through um, the thing that we're interpreting the thing we're interpreting through the thing we're interpreting it with, if
yeah.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
a way more articulate uh, pontification about that out there, but it is a hard thing, is trying to talk about these realms.
For example, breath work is the only practice I've ever done, including psychedelics, where I will process something, and it might involve tears or laughter or any other experience, but it's all through the body. It's all somatic,
Mm.
and there's no real story or thinking attached to it. But afterwards, that thing is just resolved. I no longer have that fear, or I no longer have that frustration, or whatever it is. It's just gone. And so in
But
that sense,
what it is, like if you're in a breathwork session and you're having a laughing episode, if something's changed, then you must have some
yes.
idea of
So yes. So you do know what it is sometimes, but sometimes, and you might have had this experience as well. I think many of us have. Something will process in a deep altered state, and I don't know what it was. I'm just like, whoa, there was an intense, like, what, something of emotion came up. There was a processing, and now it's gone. I'm like, and I don't know what that was. And I've actually had ayahuasca experiences where I've said, like, because I always have this dialogue with a psychedelic, whether that's me or it, or part of me, or synergy. But I'll say, I've been like, what the hell was that? And she'd be like, hey, don't worry about it. It's too complicated. You wouldn't get it. And I'm like, okay, cool. Because and so it's like, fine, okay, but did I? I just trust that probably it resolved something that was niggling away there in my unconscious or unresolved. So I do think that the missing piece might be that in different states of consciousness, our agency changes, and the nature of how we relate to the unconscious changes. But in normal waking, or in the range that we call normal waking consciousness, it feels like there's a bigger barrier between what's conscious and what's unconscious. In an altered state, that boundary becomes more fluid, but I still think then there's even deeper levels of the unconscious always. So I think it it's just always deeper levels.
As you were talking, I was thinking about, you mentioned a lot like entities were a big part of your experience on the extended DMT. And I think it's Terence McKenna has the taxonomy for DMT entities. I don't know if you've heard of this, but he has like 3 options for what these entities can be. One, they're these like semi-physical but elusive sort of beings, so they exist here, but we don't see them, like Bigfoot or the Yeti or the unicorn or whatever. And then 2 is like the mentalist reductionist version, which is that they are projections of our unconscious. And that might be, when you talk about being in an altered state, that might be a place where we can actually like pull out what's in the unconscious, like that, and dreams, because I guess sleep is an altered state as well. Or like his third one is that they are non-physical but autonomous beings. So those hypersonic chinchillas, hyperdimensional chinchillas that you encountered with, might actually be real. Like they might exist somewhere else and like have their own sovereignty, and through the drugs, like we tap into that. What do you think it is? And like, I mean, your answer to this question can also be like, it's not important to know which one of those it is.
Where I'm at with it is that they are, in a sense, semi-autonomous or autonomous, but that they exist in, let's say, a realm of mind that we're not usually connected to, or in some indigenous psychedelic using cultures in South America, that the idea of reality is quite different to ours in terms of it's based on perspectivism, which is like, it's kind of what you named, and it's similar in, I'm half Irish, and in Celtic mythology, you get this as well, that there are entities all around us all the time. It's just that we don't see them because our perspective is tuned into the wrong wavelength, let's say. But by drinking ayahuasca or tobacco or whatever other experience, or tuning in a particular way, then we are able to see what was there already. That's very different to the metaphysics that we get from Christianity originally, of like matter, like there's like the soul is like breathed into matter, like spiritus, like spirit. It's like you have dead matter, and then the soul comes into it from somewhere, a realm beyond that we don't have access to. And that's really fundamental to, well, actually a lot of world religions. That this is a whole other thing, which is in Leviathan, actually, in my documentary. John Vervaeke talks about this. The fundamental shift that happened a few thousand years ago after the Bronze Age collapsed was that we moved from worldviews that saw all of reality as one circular whole, where it kind of bound by fate. And then what happened was a shift into, wait a minute, this is not the real world. this world of matter, this fallen world full of sin and violence and death and suffering, it's not real. There's a more real world somewhere else. And so in Buddhism, you have that. Like, how do you get to the real world? Okay, you see through the illusion and you come to a space of deeper reality. And in Christianity, it's Christ proves that it's not real because he becomes resurrected, right? And it's like, we can all do that if we align to him. You get it in Judaism of like this is the we're going to go to the promised land. It's like very like bound in history. It's like kind of direction and linear. Like we're going to get to the promised land. You get it in Islam. So it's a kind of this idea that it's really fundamental to how we think now, even if we're not religious. It's like this, even the idea of self-transcendence, even the idea that we're going to improve ourselves, all of it. It's like there is a better, I'm not saying it's not true either. I'm just saying this is a kind of a fundamental philosophical idea. So with that, it becomes difficult to go, if we're encountering entities that we don't normally see, where are they? So we would not naturally, with that worldview, jump to, well, they must exist in some other realm because we already have this idea that there's more real metaphysical realms out there that we don't know about until we die or until angels come and visit us or whatever it might be. So they always come from the heavenly realm or wherever it might be, or hell, right? Like angels and demons. So that's just an assumption, right? Because the other example, the perspectivist example from South American indigenous cultures or some is no, they're all around us all the time. There's no here and there. There's just a here. And you just can't see the here because you're not tuned in properly because you haven't taken the right drugs or you haven't done the right rituals, you haven't done the right practices. So which of those? I don't know. It's tricky. We even get that idea with the unconscious that we were just talking about. There's a here, there's this present moment, and then there's something that is driving things from behind the scenes that's more real, which is the unconscious. Now that might be true, but it's still a dualist worldview, right? It's still dualist. And it's not a given, like, you mentioned you had someone you were speaking to who was like, no, I don't believe that. And it's a legitimate position to hold as well. I don't personally agree with it, but I think it's legitimate. So what are the entities? I think they are independent of our perception of them, but I think the form they take is not. And, my friend Dave Luke, who is a parapsychology professor at the University of Greenwich, he's done lots of interesting work on this and people should check it out. But one of the things he points out is that when people saw UFOs in the 1950s, the spacecraft had nuts and bolts on them, like our technology. And then as our technology became slicker and different, now the UFOs are like chrome and sleek and kind of very different. So that's really interesting, right? But we have this, and Graham Hancock wrote a book called Supernatural where he dives into this as well about like the idea of encountering beings and entities is as old as time and happens all around the world and in many, many cultures. And here in Ireland, it would have been, fairy encounters, where, people would encounter these little people wearing old timey clothing. It's always really interesting. It's always like, they're always kind of like somewhat familiar, but wrong. They're too small, they're wearing the wrong clothes, and they're kind of alien, and they're different entities. That people really, there's fairy knolls in Ireland that have been around for thousands of years, and people, in a country that is becoming more and more secular and was, very, very Catholic for a long time. Still to this day, people will kind of laugh about it, be like, "Oh yeah, up there's the fairy knoll up there. Yeah, I wouldn't go there at dusk." And they'll be kind of laughing about it, but they won't go at dusk. It's like you don't mess around with it, and I find that amazing and beautiful. There's the kind of power to these understandings.
I want to shift away from the subconscious mind and into the conscious mind and talk to you about ideas and like how you come up with all the ideas that you do and bring back things from your experiences. But before we get there, it would be remiss of me not to just ask a few more questions about fairies, because I feel like you might be the only person that I interview that are fairies. Are they in Ireland like dangerous?
Yeah, often, not always. They're very often tricksters. So
right.
they're not necessarily malicious, but they're not good either. So yeah. Yeah.
What will they do to you?
Let's say someone's like walking home and they find a fairy knoll and they get kind of lured into it, and they will have, maybe they're there for what feels like 10 minutes and they're like offered some beer or something, and like, they have a dance, and then they're like, no, I got to go home. And then they get home and 3 days have passed. Right. And so it's like there's this kind of time warp. The other common phenomena, which is the same or very similar in the UFO encounter phenomena, is the fairies wanting to interbreed with humans and to kind of have human fairy babies, which are called changelings, and they'll be like left at the
Mm.
door of a house, and then someone will be looking after this baby, but the baby's always kind of weird and always a bit sick and kind of it never really quite survives well. It's a really odd phenomena that's also in the UFO. A lot of the UFO
Mm.
phenomena is about interbreeding or being implanted, sort of like being implanted and invaded with something. And this is, I mean, it's fascinating. Again, Hancock covers this in Supernatural, and there's other stuff out there in it. I do think he's right that this is the same phenomena taking a new form. The fairy
Mm.
abduction phenomena and UFO abduction. It's, like for example, when I was in Peru in my early 20s, I went into Pacaya Samiria, which is like a nature reserve, was really interested in all of this, this crossover between fairy lore and UFO and folklore in other countries. And I was asking my guide if he had any stories, and he like one of them he had was about this. There was a older couple who lived quite isolated, and it's always the way. It's always isolated people, isolated darkness. So trailer
Mm.
parks without a lot of street lights, and people by themselves and at night. It's almost always at night. And the husband went out in his boat to sell some wood, and then in the middle of the night, while he was away for a few weeks, and then in the middle of the night, there was a knock at the door. The woman answered the door, and there was what do they call them? Lobos, like this kind of entity that they're familiar with. It's like all white, completely white, kind of humanoid entities. And then there was
Mhm.
a few of those, and what looked like a regular woman ish. And she was saying to the woman at the house, like, "Come with us. We want to take you somewhere. We want to show you something." And the woman was like, "No, no, 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 I'm not going." And they had like a boat, So instead of the UFO craft, they had a boat, but like that's an abduction experience. And she said no. And
Mm.
for whatever, they wanted consent. So that was a bit different, but they
This
were
is
a bit
like,
nicer.
yeah, they're very woke.
Really? Yeah, that's right. Woke aliens in the jungle. So, but that phenomena is, I would be very surprised if that woman had ever come across, like a kind of contemporary UFO account, but that you get thousands and thousands of stories like that. So if you take away the form and look at just the aspects of the phenomenon, where like entities from a different reality or from this reality that we don't normally see want to take us somewhere and often want to interbreed or implant us with something or whatever it might be. God knows what's going on with that. I find it hard to maintain the position that that's all just your mind playing. Like, I don't know, like it seems a bit absurd to me. Like, I'm like, there's a
Mm.
phenomena at play, so we should investigate it scientifically, but it's
Mhm.
not scientific to come at it with the assumption that the only thing that's real is matter and mind is secondary. Got to leave everything on open and on the table.
I don't know. It's what we were saying before about there being like some kind of collective. Well, we didn't go into it, but you mentioned that you do believe that there is a collective unconscious, and perhaps that's where we're pulling out these themes or these like motifs or the 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 things that tend to spread across all of those stories of being abducted. I think it's interesting too, the interbreeding thing. And I wondered, as you were talking about that, whether that's like some sort of like perverse, like sexual thing that's happening under the hood, like people that being like a big driver of, well, like it's what ensures the survival of our species. But I think that there's a lot more like sexual stuff going on under the hood than we are obviously consciously aware of. And I wonder if that's kind of like playing into why people think that they're being lured off to be bred with, because like who knows if these things even breed. Like we don't even know what they are. Like
Exactly.
that's a very human survival thing, thing that's being superimposed onto something that's probably more mystical. I read your book and I thought it was fascinating, and you pulled together so many different ideas. And it seems like now you've gone on to make this documentary, which is sort of like almost a follow up to the thoughts that you were chewing on in the book.
Yeah.
And I just wonder about the nature of ideas. Like, how do you come up with your ideas? How do you make them manifest? What's your research process like? How do you bring stuff back from psychedelic trips? A lot of questions in there, but just
Mm.
like whatever
Yeah.
feels pertinent to talk about.
Well, okay. So I read this amazing book, I guess in my like early 20s, called Strategic Intuition. It's based on neuroscience and military strategy. Interestingly, it's a really interesting book. So the idea is that creativity is always a new combination of existing elements in our unconscious. And so what happens is that there's 4 stages. The first stage is examples from history that is written by a guy called William Duggan. And so first you have a library of experience and information. And what you need is to make that library as full as possible. So Napoleon, for example, had read every recorded example of a military battle he could get his hands on when he was in military school. He just had it all in his head. He just was fascinated by it. So he'd read all of that. And then the next stage is presence of mind. So you're not trying to solve the answer. You're actually paying attention to what's going on in the world and the environment. So he, in one of his first battles where he was just like a corporal or something, he had a eureka moment. He had this flash of insight, because that's the third thing, because existing elements combine. So he looked at the battlefield and he saw that there was like a cliff, and he saw that they were coming in on boats, and he was like, unconsciously, his brain had gone, he had some information that from some previous battle from like, thousands of years ago that he'd read, but in the moment it just hits you it just kind of hits you. You just know. You're just like, we need to move the cannons up into the top of the thing. And the other officers were like, no, what do you know? You're just some young dude. And of course, like, they lost the battle, and had they done that, they would have won. You could also take Picasso. So Picasso was an impressionist artist. And if you look at Picasso's paintings before he was like Picasso as we know him, they're just like, he's obviously talented, but it's just kind of like a bit mid. He's just kind of doing what everyone else is doing, And so he was at a lunch with Matisse, and Matisse's niece was with them, and she was holding an African mask, because in colonial France, it was the kind of thing that you could, get, because they, had African colonies. And Picasso saw the mask, which was like very angular and kind of square-like. And he just was like, couldn't get his eyes off it. He's like, what is that? Where did you get it? I couldn't really focus during the lunch, and just was like, I've got to go. Went back to his studio, and then Cubism happened, which is African mask plus Impressionism equals Cubism. Well, simply, of course, it develops. Same with Google. It was just, what if, with trying to create a search engine, they were like, well, what if we took academic citations, so the most cited thing is at the top and the least cited thing is at the bottom, and combined it with Alta Vista, which they were at whatever, I think they were at Harvard or MIT. They just were able to download the entirety of Alta Vista and just apply that algorithm to it. And that was Google initially. And it was just a way better search. But there's 2 things that already existed together. The examples just go on and on and on of that. So, and that moment of insight, that eureka moment, that's usually how I experience creativity. Like, for example, I was Lord of the Rings remake on Amazon a few years ago. And I was like, why are all the orcs speaking in a Cockney accent from East London, and all the elves are really posh, and they're all like blonde hair and blue eyed? And then then what popped into my head was Nazi elves and Cockney orcs. And I was like, oh yeah, I really want to write that piece. So often I get just the title of a piece. I wrote a piece a few years before that called Indigenous Narcissism, that came up when I was at a festival, and I was like, oh yeah, that's good. What is it? So sometimes the title cascades. It's not always the way, but that's my favorite. That's often what will happen, but it's because hidden within the title. So that whole piece was about class politics. I'm not really a Marxist, but I do think class is a fundamental driver of social dynamics. And so that's why, that was the Lord of the Rings one. And so sometimes it just, things pop into our heads. And I think that is the nature of creativity. And then the 4th stage in Duggan's model is the courage and commitment to carry it through. That you have the idea, but just having the idea, we all have great ideas, but then we have to go, okay, and you need the skills and the resourcing to go, okay, I'm going to put that into the world, or I'm going to take the risk and say, no, this is what I think is going on. Like Picasso going, okay, this looks mad, but I'm feeling like this is a thing. I write fiction as well, but I write creative nonfiction, would be, I guess, the genre. So it's essays looking at cultural and social issues largely, but also tech and lots of other areas, and consciousness, done in a format which brings in some of the techniques of, fiction writing. And the New Yorker kind of pioneered this kind of style. So it's like it's a nonfiction essay, but it's got creative elements in it. And then very practically, after I have the idea, then there's a whole research phase because you need to basically, you need to back up the thesis. And also the more you read, the richer your idea becomes. And there's a journalist, Ezra Klein, New York
Mm,
Times, and he said something in his podcast one time that I thought was great and really found very true. Is like, if you get stuck writing, it's almost always because you haven't done enough research.
mhm,
And it's absolutely true because you don't know what you want to say. And that's the stuckness. It's not because of some kind of vague idea like there's a writer's block or something. It's because you don't have enough information in the tank to draw on. And you have to there's no I don't think there's really shortcuts to anything in life. And so the no shortcut to good writing is good research. You just have to go, okay, did I read enough of that book? Have I spoken to enough people about this? Have I interviewed enough people? Have I really dived into it? And then once you do that, that's when you get those other little eureka moments where you're like, oh, that's how those things connect. That's the joy of it for me, is the two things that are not connected and connecting them. And usually that's where my biggest ideas come from, is I go, like the trauma piece. I was like, for months and months, I was thinking, not everyone's that traumatized. This is bullshit. I don't believe this. I think the whole trauma narrative has gotten way out of hand.
mhm,
And I don't know how yet, but I know. Like, I really have, well, I don't know. I have a strong feeling that there's something missing here. And that's like the journalistic hunch. And that's why,
mhm.
there's a level of cynicism in my line of work. What need is this filling? And what, in filling that need, how much is being papered over of the complexity? Like internal family systems, IFS, that'll be the next one, I think, because I'm like, everyone's so into it. Where's the gap? Where's the contradiction? Where's the whatever it might be, so there's just, I just have a suspicion when people are really into stuff.
No, I think it's amazing. I can totally relate to it. It's almost like it was the thing that was driving that question I asked you about the unconscious, subconscious, is because that's your buzzword, particularly when it comes to like anything that is trying to be sold as a rewire your mind, or like a course online. People are often talking about the subconscious, and it's just sort of dawned on me that like we don't even know what that is. We don't even know if you can access it. And so I like, not that I was giving you a taste of your own medicine or anything before, but
Mm,
I feel
yeah.
like I feel resonance with that need to look into cultural fads with a skeptical eye, and ask like, well, who's this benefiting?
It's about it's like you were saying before, discernment. I think it's unfortunately effective to assume that there's some kind of mismatch or, maybe even scam going on with that kind of thing, because where my mind goes to is the easiest thing to sell that you can continuously say, like, well, you're doing it wrong, is something that can't be seen and is intangible, like the unconscious, It's like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying everyone's doing that at all. I'm sure there's people doing lots of good work, but anything that is intangible and can be defined in many different ways and interpreted in many different ways is a really easy thing to sell people on.
What do you think the future looks like? We're rapidly adopting AI. The internet isn't slowing down. Everyone's a digital entrepreneur with a personal brand. Like, what do you think? Where do you think we're heading?
So many of our assumptions and so many of our institutions are in flux. At the same time, I think there are human universals that will always be the case. One of them is that we want to feel what is most real and feel human connection. Now, the internet, as it is increasingly becoming a place of unreality, where, like you said, everyone's second self, like their internet personality, is increasingly, it's detached from their real, authentic, present self in the body. I was writing a book about, or a book proposal about the way AI is changing spirituality and religion, which, because it's moving so fast, I turned into a Substack series that I'm putting out at the moment in chunks. And so I've thought a lot about that, in the terms of how technology is changing our view on reality, and always has in some ways. I think that'll continue to happen. I think we'll see AI religions. I think we already are, but I think we'll see bigger AI religions. AI is filling like a God-shaped hole in society. Some of us will go the full transhumanist route of, let's become the machine, let's upload our consciousness into machines and leave the human body. And then others, there's a movement towards touching grass, coming back
Mm.
into face-to-face contact. That's definitely the area where I lean to, and probably most of the people in my life who like, hugging trees and hugging each other. There's a kind of movement towards that. And then also there's there's a synergy, and I'm interested in this. I'm doing a few projects at the moment on this, of how do we use AI and, for example, like wearable tech to bring us back into connection with each other. So I think we can use technology for that. And that's, at least on the tech side, that's how I can see things going. I think we're going to see, and are seeing, a real rejection of the internet and AI in its current form, with all the slop and all of the, inability to trust what we're seeing, and a return to trusted sources of information and connection. So that's each other, people in the flesh, not online, not mediated online. That's thing, we're kind of reaching a saturation point for many.
Where can people find your work if they want to follow you and keep an eye out for this Substack series?
Yeah, so probably the best place is Instagram, just Alexander_Beiner. So because I update on there when I have a new piece out on Substack. My Substack is the place I post most. That's Kainos is my creative studio and media platform, Kinos. But just beiner.substack.com as well, and then people can dive into the really weird world of AI religion. It is actually really fascinating what's going on. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Paige. It was a lot of fun.